Welcome to The Midpoint, conversations with the extraordinary people building the American innovation economy from the inside out. I'm Patrick McKenna, founder of One America Works. Welcome to The Midpoint. I'm Patrick McKenna, founder of One America Works, and it is my great pleasure to have Aaron George on our show today. I'm particularly interested in sharing Aaron's story with our audience. He captures so many of the important aspects of entrepreneurship, and has done it in just unique ways that I can't wait for more people to hear about his story. So Aaron, welcome to the program.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Excited to be on and share my story.
Yeah, it's terrific. You know, what we're trying to do here with the program is just highlight founders who are operating kind of in the interior of the country and in heartland cities, and who have overcome a lot of obstacles to show that there's just talented people working everywhere solving big problems, and that adversity many times is leading to the solution that makes your business even better. And I think your background and your story and your path is, I think, as you're hearing me talk about this, is probably resonating. I can't wait to dig in a little bit.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about sort of my background and how I got into this whole entrepreneurial journey, if you will, and I guess that'll lay the ground of more questions from there.
Yeah, it's so funny because I was thinking, just like when we got to know you initially, and the fact that you're in Cleveland and you started a business that was like right at the cusp of COVID, right? Like you were just getting started with something else. COVID happens and it changed everything. And I'd love for you just to talk about like what it was like to be going down one path and then the world change, and then you see this big opportunity and kind of pivot right immediately into something that's even bigger than you originally set off to do.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a very interesting time in my life, especially when the pandemic hit. My previous startup was called Pastry Now, and it was an on-demand marketplace that connected local bakeries and home bakers to college students late at night. And up until sort of March of 2020, which is when the pandemic went into full swing, we were growing across Case Western, started getting into Cleveland State, and we were effectively mostly competing against Insomnia Cookies, which was still sort of this multi-billion-dollar conglomerate for some reason. And we started expanding through, but then we lost our customer demographic pretty much overnight. And that's where I went back to the drawing board. I had a lot of stakeholders that I'd worked with in the past, like bakery owners, restaurant group owners in particular. And one of them, his name was Matt Van, who owned the Jolly Scholar Group on the Case campus, a few restaurants, cafe, food truck. And we've always talked about a few ideas for food service, but we never really did anything about it. And I already had my own startup that I was dealing with. And the pandemic sort of highlighted a lot of the shortcomings that the restaurant industry faced. And that's where I started paying a lot more attention over sort of the course of those following months, where I started doing a deep dive, working hands-on with Matt Van, pretty much through all annals of his restaurant group. One point, I even did a little bit of line cooking and stuff just to help him get by, because you know how it is for restaurants, how hectic it is. But more importantly, I handle all of his purchasing. And when I started to notice how he would buy, thousands of dollars worth of product from 3-4 of these key distributors, but even on top of that, he would have to supplement a lot of his deliveries with like almost daily Instacart ordering. Things started to click a little bit. And I originally have a background in civil engineering, so construction management with a little bit of an emphasis on procurement was what I focused on in college. And noticing how there was a lot more of a foundation and structure to how some of those construction procurement processes go. If you look at how extensive bidding is, and how much more put together, I think is the best word for it, versus for food service, a lot of it was fairly traditional. There were still people using papers, faxing, phone calls. Pricing was this puzzle that you had to sort of figure out. If you didn't spend enough time, it cost you a lot. We've seen 10 to 15% just for a restaurant that's already running on thin margins. That's a lot. And I thought about ways where I could help out, just because restaurants were absolutely suffering with labor issues, food costs rising. It's not like you have a ton of investors lining up all excited about the restaurant industry like it was, even a decade ago.
And for
And
context, you came to the US for the first time in 2015, right? You came here for college. Is that right?
yeah, yeah. Originally from Dubai, the UAE, born and raised, but yeah, I came here first in 2015 to do my undergrad at Case Western.
And so you show up and you're now in Cleveland and you study civil engineering, but like, why did you become an entrepreneur? Like, what was it that got you, like, is it in your family? Is it like you met somebody? Like, what got you thinking that I'm going to start a company in general?
So family definitely played a part. The closest would be my mom. She is a small business owner. She owns a few beauty salons in the UAE, India at one point too. But it was always inspiring to sort of see in Dubai and India, for women in entrepreneurship in particular, there was a lot of nuances, and it was harder enough to do. So very inspirational to see my mom sort of build things from the ground up. She worked in beauty salons as managers, saved up enough cash and started her first branch and started expanding from there. So I would, from a very young age, help her out with pretty much everything from marketing, helping her with her website at one point, helping with just general sales ideas, accounting, those kind of things. And I would always hear, even though things would go well, there was always problems. And it was interesting to see how, on a daily basis, you can solve some of those things. But what pushed me a lot more to the food tech side was I actually did a study abroad program in Madrid while I was still in college. And one of my professors there, he was doing his global MBA and had a food tech background. So we were talking about things like underground kitchens, and the food delivery scene was a lot more advanced considering there's a lot more restaurants in Europe than North America even. And I think I started mentoring with him a little bit, understanding sort of different ways to, just get into the space, because I saw a lot of excitement in Europe versus in America. It was there, but it was different, And what got me interested was, so at first I started my little concept that I used to call Foodoo, or Project Food. Okay. And what that did was we looked at local barriers in neighborhoods and looked at a sustainability play where regular people could sort of sell their surplus meals to their neighbors nearby. And it builds a little bit more of a sustainable home cooked food movement, which was interesting. We got a few chefs, drivers, even figured out that in Madrid, you need 3 licenses, which costed 10 euros a piece. So it wasn't like impossible, but when I came back to America, I found out about the long-standing history of cottage food laws, how back in the 70s, apparently large corporations like McDonald's lobbied against Amish people because they had to pay for commercial kitchens and Amish people didn't. So
interesting.
It took me down a very interesting path because I worked a lot with the IPv8 case to help try to figure out the legal sort of implications of all of this. And I even found that there was a company in California called Josephine that raised money, like we're trying to bring regulation in place. And they unfortunately closed down, but eventually did make micro kitchen home laws legal in certain counties in California. So even back then, I knew there were a lot of challenges just to get across the vision that we were trying to accomplish. So I looked at ways to sort of pivot, and that's how Pastry Now came to light, where we use the loophole of cottage food laws, where we're primarily focusing on non-perishables, dry products, and sell a lot of the surplus products that bakeries and home bakers have, connect them to a demographic that has few, if any, options late at night, and that needs it. And that's kind of how things click together.
So this is a really interesting journey, right? So this is one of the things, like your family, your mom, she was very entrepreneurial. You watched that. There was something about it that attracted you to kind of the independence that you get from it, but you also saw the challenges. And then you went off to Madrid, and you probably didn't quite know that you were going to meet somebody, learn from somebody, kind of start building out a knowledge set, outside of what you had known. And then you get some expertise, right? And then when you return, it's so fascinating that now you're back in Cleveland and you're like, I want to start something. And then you start learning a whole nother set of laws, or rules rather. So a lot of times people think that becoming an entrepreneur is you like wake up one morning, I have an idea, and you just start it. The truth is, like, there's a lot of iteration that you have to do, right? And there's a lot of paths to follow. You're learning about this law. You mentioned a company that tried it, and you learned millions of dollars of mistakes for free, right? By just reading about that story.
Yeah, it was the Josephine story. I spent a lot of time doing like very detailed case studies because I was determined, because for an entrepreneur, there is a little sense of ego where you think, the whole thing is you are dealt with problems day in and day out. You're supposed to triumph over all of it, but it's also understanding the limitations and what's actually sort of, iteratable, like you said, and achievable over, milestones that you can set. But yeah, Josephine definitely saved me a lot of money, time, and yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
And so now you do find an idea and you start it, and then COVID happens. Now, you started to talk about your pivot, but you also alluded to having a partner in Supply Now, in the new company. Can you talk a little bit about, because so many people are going to go back and forth. Do you do as a sole founder, which you started, or did a co-founder? There's pros and cons to it. But if you do get a partner, it is really important who you partner with and that you're really aligned. Can you talk a little bit about how you guys came together as partners and kind of what that process was like?
Yeah. So, like for now, at least when it comes to Matt Van, we came together over the course of sort of Pastry Now unfolding and looking at ways to sort of iterate over its evolution. I've had a relationship with him for a few years. We even tried to do a few sort of mini events with Pastry Now and sort of pair brewed, brewery type concepts with like pastries we had. But through that, we still kept sort of a working relationship there. Matt Van also had his own startup idea he was working on called Greenlight Grocery that had a certain level of intersection with food service purchasing and supplies. And we were always sort of fairly interested in this. He's had 16 years of restaurant experience, started his own food service distribution company down in Florida, which he eventually ended up selling. So through that phase, early on, it was just a lot of just discussions to understand, okay, what are we looking to essentially solve through this? What are the overarching goals and the milestones and iterations it's going to take to get there? What are the expectations on both ends of that journey? Just because, to your point, a sole founder, there are a lot of cases where it can work, but having people that you can sort of work with and rely on and help you sort of grow your business is definitely beneficial. And I think the partner relationships there's a lot that needs to be discussed early on to set the base of the foundation of how it grows. And you shouldn't be afraid to sort of have the hard conversations every now and then, just because that is what a startup, that's what the startup life entails. It's a lot of bad news and some good news every now and then, and you push your way to get more and more good news. And I think having people that can go into like that active problem solving mentality and at least help you get the job done. And even if it's the worst case solution of bandaging something and living to fight another day, like that in itself is huge.
So you guys were working together on the other company, and then you decided to do Supply Now together kind of as a new project. Is that right?
So Supply Now was like, I was always with Pastry Now sort of changing. I was looking at a way for an intersection between sort of the logistics and mobility of what we were doing and helping restaurants with supplies and procurement. And Matt, given his experience and what he was working on, definitely helped sort of get us to where we wanted to be in terms of where we are now with procurement and logistics. But we were looking at sort of ways where both companies could sort of benefit and help each other in this sort of symbiotic relationship. And that's where we saw some advantages with sort of a lot less overhead costs associated. Different companies can focus on different parts of the problem that are already behemoths in itself. And you're probably familiar how big the food service industry is and the size of the problems associated, where there's delicate balances involved with major relationships with like distributors and retailers versus sort of the client dynamic when you're dealing with different types of restaurants. So there was a lot of intricacies behind it. There was a lot of ideas for what Supply Now wanted to do and for what Greenlight wanted to do. And that's where, that extensive process of just understanding what is Supply Now's focus and how are we going to be hyper focused on getting the job done for the restaurants and the distributors we're trying to essentially connect and solve a lot of these logistics and procurement hurdles for.
So it's a bit of an evolution, right? So you're like flowing through these different things. It's the classic journey. Now, this is, I feel like there's always this moment, right? So was there a breakthrough moment where you were doing the old thing and then you're like, got a lot of clarity on the new thing? Was that something that you remember as a moment? And what was that like?
The eureka moment. So
Yes.
few things. One, the Instacart moment where we would have to order this stuff every day. Matt would have to pay 25 to 40% more. The deliveries were a nightmare. I would have to help, like I would have to go outside the restaurant, figure out where they were dropping it off, haul in heavy product. And it was a lot to deal with. And the fact that the distributors were that much more costlier than just doing it through Instacart and keeping up with these hurdles, that was the first piece that just automatically clicked and said, okay, the supply chain is clearly broken. Crisis deliveries are a thing. Labor has just been magnified where you can't afford to send your managers or your chefs or your owners. And wholesale B2B deliveries are the evolution of the gig economy where you're moving a $10 hamburger between point A and point B. I think that was the first eureka moment. And the second was how restaurants usually have to, like some restaurateurs, they're called spreadsheeters, which is what Matt was. If you don't compare with at least 3 or more vendors on a weekly basis, you're losing a lot of money in the process. And now starting to combine some of those relationships, go further in and understand opportunities for market arbitrage where you can drive down savings. That was sort of another moment where the procurement side of things really started to stand out because you're dealing with restaurants on average spending $250,000 to $350,000 a year on procurement. So every percent in savings, matters.
So you guys were really living the problem. So you had your eureka moment while you're in the flow. Again, you had a business started. This is another one of those big lessons for entrepreneurs, is like to sit on the sidelines and kind of dream about, yeah, someday I'm going to start a company. That's a really good idea. And to not get started, you took the opposite approach. You got started. And maybe the first idea wasn't the idea. And the second one, you got some traction, but you met a partner, you got deep into a problem. And while you're doing that, the world turned upside down, right, with the COVID. And then you saw a deeper problem in the industry that you then were positioned to solve. So the one of the big lessons here, I think, is that you had a car in the race. Like you had something to start building around that opportunity. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, going into this with expectations is definitely hard. You have to be open to a lot of change and be able to adapt. I think that was the biggest lesson I learned through all of this.
Was there a moment, hey Aaron, was there a moment where you thought about quitting?
I mean, there were times where things were very rough, but not necessarily quitting, just because this is what I love to do. I don't see myself doing anything else.
I was going to ask you what your motivation was. So what kept you from quitting? I guess, let me ask it again. What kept you from quitting?
I'd say one, the motivation behind I'd say personally, I like sort of going out there and having the control over being able to move fast, solve problems, and help people. And I think even beyond that, just with my mom and the business, small business, owner blood in me, I've always been more acclimated towards that side. My dad, he chose the 9-to-5 route, and not to say he's not happy or anything, but I've definitely seen a lot more benefits to just even your life and how you're able to grow as a human being. And I think I've never really thought of quitting, but I've definitely had moments where things were very hard. And, I think the internal motivation behind that's also the immigration factor behind all of this, just because there's a lot of systemic pressure and burden that comes with being an immigrant in America, now more so than even before, just because, I don't know if you know, there's things like extensive lottery systems. You're from a country that has a large population. So I'm from Dubai, but they don't give you birthright. So you have to have 3 lines of fathers that were born and raised there. So it's a little bit more complicated. So I'm technically an Indian citizen that was born and raised in Dubai. So there's even more complications, but Indians have 10, 15-year backlogs. It's insane. And the fact that you have to go through a lottery system and pay thousands of dollars a piece is just a nightmare in itself. And that's where I also, so up until the
Wait, are you
3 years,
saying that the actual immigration system in the US is better than is easier than some country around the world? I'm joking. It sounds like
oh, no, no.
it sounds like the Dubai one is very difficult. We like to, it's difficult here, but there might even be more difficult there.
So the good thing about Dubai is it's more difficult for citizenship, but everything else is exponentially easier. Work permits, residential permits, and now they've started becoming a little bit more forward thinking with golden visas is what they call it.
Oh, sure.
And so it's getting a lot better, but the problem with America is it takes a lot more time to implement a lot of these policies. So even though there's a lot of forward-thinking ideas, going through the bureaucracy of the system just drags along the process. And ironically enough, I didn't even get to stay in the country through the regular process. I had to go out of my way, work with local nonprofits, and create a program for Cleveland that created pathways for local immigrant entrepreneurs. I have a bad habit of every time I see a problem, I have to like.
I love that. That's right in your blood from what you're saying from your mom. You know, I would love for you to talk about Cleveland. Like, why did you decided to stay in Cleveland after you graduated? It sounds like there's a lot of places, a lot of off ramps. You could have gone to Madrid. You could have gone back to Dubai. You could have gone to Silicon Valley or New York or Boston or Chicago, but you actually you went even further. You created a special program for immigrant founders to stay in Cleveland. What is it about Cleveland that you've fallen in love with and are so committed to?
I like the potential that Cleveland has. It used to be a very rich, big city with the Rockefellers and everyone, but considering what happened with the Rust Belt, jobs moving away to China, and you're probably familiar with the whole background, it's been in a little bit of a decline for a while. And the previous mayor, Frank Jackson, he was the longest standing mayor for a while. He had also a very slow moving, it wasn't the best. And Cleveland, as a result, started to stagnate. I fell in love with Cleveland when I went to Case, honestly, just because it's a big city with a small city feeling, if you will. It has a capacity for 1 million people, but only 250,000 people live there. There's vibrant hospitals. Cleveland Clinic is even in Dubai, and like sheikhs fly to Cleveland Clinic for surgeries and operations. And I think there's a lot of that untapped potential that I see, where if I went to a more saturated place like California, there's value I can provide, but there's more of a need here. And that's why I like the Midwest in particular, beyond just Cleveland in itself, just because I think the Midwest is going to be set up next for, a major type of boom, just because traditionally the way cities have grown has been initially through coast, just to have ships come in, make it easier for trade, populations grow. But then after a certain point, especially with shocks like the pandemic, you have businesses that have been a lot more oversaturated and illiquid, just because if you look at restaurants in high density places like New York, even a month or day long disruption to business has drastic implications to your overall unit economics with respect to things like rent that you pay. So you're giving business owners and the population an inherent need to start moving away from these heavily dense areas and more into places that need more people and need an influx of ideas, capital, and growth at the end of the day. So it's more of a philosophy rather than,
But it sounds like you have a very specific kind of long philosophy for Cleveland and places like it, that the current environment is more dynamic, that there's a lot of upside and opportunity. And so the problems that you're solving there are problems that need to be solved everywhere. Is that right?
Yeah.
I love this. This would be could you just now kind of dive in, like, so supply now, I'm a little bit familiar with your model. It's been evolving a little bit even more recently. Could you give us like the 1 minute on the innovation, kind of the kernel of truth that the business is built on?
Absolutely. So in a sentence, Supply Now is a digital purchasing and logistics powerhouse, if you will. We think of ourselves as a food service Swiss Army knife that helps both restaurants and distributors. In terms of the nitty gritties, three key parts of our value proposition come to mind. We serve at the intersection of giving you that much more affordable and efficient crisis deliveries and further optimized routine or recurring weekly purchasing that restaurants usually go through. We do this in a few ways. One, more effective real-time product mapping, where we look at different stores, distributors, retailers, and try to find the best combination of places to go and source from, whether it's in a crisis or in a general order, which obviously has implications on with costs and time savings. Time, 5 to 8 hours, cost 10 to 15 on average. When you look at volume consolidation, similar to what a virtual GPU would be, we try to consolidate demand for different restaurants and even look at ways to consolidate the demand for the labor need that distributors have through some of the crisis deliveries that we have set up. So we have our own internal fleet of drivers and gig economy workers as well. Both restaurants and food service distributors can avail of us in a crisis 7 days a week, as early as 1 to 3 hours. For restaurants, it's more about the volatility of demand, inventory, wastage, versus for distributors, it's more about mispicks in the restaurant, volatility in drivers, the shortage with CDL drivers in itself. And our advantages, we use more effective vehicles and processes with our technology. So vehicles, commercial, right under that CDL threshold. So we don't have the same, challenges of overhead that other traditional distributors and last mile mobility sort of platforms do.
So what's the big vision? So definitely supply chain productivity. Where does this go? Because it's like you were saying at the beginning, the size of this industry is enormous. And like, could you give us 30 seconds on like what's the big vision of where you want to take supply now?
So the big thing that I want to do with Supply Now is help us sort of reshape how the food service industry, it's in particular the supply chain, is going to be evolving, particularly with the post-pandemic and sort of more like structural and foundational changes that are happening. So the last part that I meant is more previously, because we've been in this massive boom, we've seen more of a lean methodology approach where people try to keep things limited on stock and they focus more on just they have a relationship with the supplier. But now there's more of a need for also having an agile methodology in place where you can start responding to real-time shocks and crises. I think not only are we going to be hopefully playing a big pivotal part in sort of changing the way that the distributor and restaurant relationship is sort of going to be structurally different over these next few years by introducing some of the technological inefficiencies, by removing some of the baseline things like calling a phone rep, faxing in things, but still bringing in the convenience of that simplicity behind the product, like something as simple as one-click text ordering. It's still technology. We use a Twilio microservice, but it's just so easy and simple that regardless of how old or technologically unsavvy you are, getting through that curve is where we, I think, can play a real part in and sort of digitize this industry over the coming decade.
That's a big vision. I love that. As we start to wrap up, I'd love to get your take on, like, there's a lot of trends that are happening, not just around food, but distributed work, capital, AI, like there's so many things going on. Is there some trend, some technological innovation, some social trend, something, like if there's like one thing that you have an eye on that you'd want to share with people to say, this is something that not a lot of people are focused on yet, but they should be?
I would say ideally on the tech-enabled service sector. So there's been a lot of an emphasis on initially more pure software applications, which are great, but it's a different strategy in itself. You need to focus more on becoming a market leader, and if not, you get crushed. And there are cases where you can start, building these duopolies or oligopolies, but even then, software is becoming a lot more saturated versus I think tech-enabled services is the future, just because there's a lot of blue-collar work, if you will, that still has a lot of traditional sort of implementations in it, where things like I mentioned, like just calling in, faxing, using spreadsheets, and like there's a lot of that redundancy that you can remove by sort of infusing technology. I think the biggest thing is look for some of the industries that aren't as glossy. I'd say even something as unflattering as garbage disposal, there's a massive need just because no one wants to do it. And I think that mentality of just thinking about what are the problems people want to solve. Obviously, technology is important, but how can you infuse it into real world, like physical day-to-day applications? And I think that's what gives you that competitive advantage to deliver so much more and execute a lot better in the process.
Awesome. Well, thanks for sharing your story and insights. Again, congratulations on all the success, and we look forward to keeping track of Supply Now as you move forward. Thanks again.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.